Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 639 for the 10th of January 2021. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Oh, I think it's going to be a bright sunny day, which is unusual. For the last couple of weeks, it's been cloudy, rainy, cloudy, muggy, hot, rainy, cloudy, hot, rainy, muggy. Might be a good day for a long walk. Coming up at the top of the show, I talked to Adrienne Hill from Canada, a new old friend of mine. I've been dealing with, enjoying my time seeing Adrienne online during the Great Prediction Project and during Susan Gerbich's trivia quiz. She spoke at Monterey Skepticamp just last week, as did I, and she was speaking about Tourette Syndrome. It was such an interesting talk, I thought I would interview her for the Skeptic Zone, and you'll discover some of the so-called alternative treatments being offered to people with Tourette Syndrome, like homeopathy and things like that. Following that, it's Logical Fallacies with Michelle Bijkersma. Hello, Michelle, down there in Victoria. And what have you for us this week, Michelle? You will be speaking about Affirming the Consequent. I wonder what that's all about. Find out later on with Michelle Bijkersma. Then to round off the show, it's another dive into Trove. We continue our series Into the Unknown. And this week, our so-called medium, Mrs. Hughes, goes into a trance and is taken over by the spirit of White Feather. A fascinating look at investigations into the paranormal from 1950. And this is a continuing series. There'll be more next week and the week after. Now, speaking of meetings online, like Skepticamp in Monterey just the other week, we also had here in Sydney, just in the past few days, Australian Skeptics, Sydney Skeptics in the pub. Our guest speaker was Kenny Biddle, the well-known paranormal investigator. If you missed seeing that live, you can now see that on YouTube at the Australian Skeptics YouTube channel, and I'll link to that in the show notes. And a big thank you to Kenny Biddle for staying up to some stupid hour in the morning to join us live here in Sydney. And also coming up on the 18th of January, so the 18th of this month, on Monday the 18th, we have Skeptics Cafe from Victoria. And their special guest speaker next time will be Gabrielle Jackson. Now, she's the Associate Editor, News and Audio for The Guardian Australia and was previously the Opinion Editor. She's the author of Pain and Prejudice, which has been published in Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada, just about everywhere. So her talk is about chronic pain. What is chronic pain and who gets it? Why do we know so little about the mechanisms of chronic pain? A painful subject, and you can find out more as you tune in live to Skeptics Cafe on Monday the 18th, no matter where you are in the world, and I will add a link in this week's show notes. I'm tempted to make some sort of editorial or commentary about the situation in Washington over the past few days. I think I really don't have to say too much. Lots of other people will say something far more wise and intelligent than I can, I'm sure. But maybe I will comment on the fact that what you probably saw is a demonstration of a almost complete lack of critical thinking on the part of the people who stormed the Capitol building. And what better example can you possibly have of the saying, well, what's the harm? What's the harm in believing in conspiracy theories? What's the harm when you fall for the logical fallacy of argument from authority? What's the harm when you take matters into your own hands? I will make a prediction, though. I think I can predict quite safely that between now and the next episode of the Skeptic Zone, we're all in for a wild ride. It might do us well to remember more blissful memories of things we've done in our lives from times past. I'm sure you have some wonderful memories. I certainly do. Now it's time for me to run downstairs and make myself a potato and zucchini fritter. Fry that up on the fry pan. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. And joining me now from beautiful Calgary, Alberta, Canada, the winter wonderland, the home of the Calgary Stampede, it's Adrienne Hill. Hello, Adrienne.
Hi, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Look, do you, well, apart from last year, of course, do you often front up at the Calgary Stampede?
Not very often, to be honest.
Oh.
We go occasionally. We particularly like the entertainment part of it, but I don't tend to go to much of the rodeo.
Oh, okay. And I was just about to say, for those people who may not know, it's a giant rodeo. It's Canada's biggest rodeo, I think.
It is, yes. I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of North America's largest rodeos.
Well, let's hope, fingers crossed and toes crossed, that they can hold it this year.
Yes, it was canceled this last year.
Yeah, like everything else.
Yeah, everything else, exactly.
Everything else. Now, the reason I've contacted you, Adrienne, is we're old friends. We've never met, but we're old friends. We've been seeing each other, so to speak. We've been seeing each other most of 2020 with Susan Gerbich's wonderful weekly trivia games. And
yes,
the interesting, bizarre Australian prediction project where you're one of the volunteers helping to score psychics' predictions going back 20 years. Before we get into the main topic, I hope you're enjoying that prediction.
It's awesome.
Predicting.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten to know many celebrities I'd never heard of that are famous in Australia. And I've learned all about the weather in Australia.
Yes.
And crime in Australia.
Yes.
So I can't wait to go to Australia.
That's right. And you've learned all sorts of things about Nicole Kidman you never knew.
That's right. That's correct.
And things I think she never knew either. That's right. Now, and I think I've let the prediction team know that we were sort of, the end was in sight. There was light at the end of the tunnel after thousands of predictions. And I've just in the last week discovered a whole new archive of predictions. You have no idea. So this will keep us happy for some months to come.
Going.
It keeps on going.
That's good. It's fun. It's a fun group and we have a good time, and it's been good during COVID, particularly because of the isolation. It's something to look forward to every week.
Yeah, I'm pleased about that. Now, let's talk about the main topic that I did contact you about today. Now, Tourette's. Now, you gave a wonderfully interesting talk just a few days ago at Susan Gerbich's Monterey Skepticamp online, which was enormous fun. What interesting talks there were. And I found your talk particularly interesting. Just as a quick overview for people who may not know, they've probably heard the term Tourette's, but don't know too much about it. What's the concise version? What's it all about?
Well, most people consider it to be the swearing tic, and that's actually a bit of a myth. It's mostly just verbal tics and motor tics, and that's Tourette syndrome. If you have both of those for more than a year, diagnosed before the age of 18, you have Tourette syndrome. So most people do not have the swearing tic, though of course it is possible. So about 10% of people with Tourette syndrome will have a swearing tic. But as I say, most people don't have it, and they do tend to change. So even if you have the swearing tic for a month, a year, or 2 years, most likely it will go away and be replaced by something else. It might be worse, it might be better.
That's interesting, because I think most people, if they've thought about it at all, would think of the swearing tic, which has probably been made popular in some TV shows or movies or something like that.
Yes.
But you're saying it's just a tic. So it could be a physical tic.
Yes. Most of the tics, actually, they usually start off being motor tics or physical tics, movements. Any movement that you can think of can become a tic. And the most common tic is an eye blinking or eye rolling tic. Those are quite prevalent and usually the first ones to show up.
That's interesting. But that's not, I guess it's not so socially noticeable than the swearing. And not even the swearing. You can say it can be any word or phrase.
they're not intentional. So phrases that don't make sense, but they can sort of make sense, such as my oldest son Graham. He would always say to me, what's for dinner tonight, Mom? And he would say it in the morning, he would say it after school, but then he would say it during dinner and after dinner as well. So then it doesn't make sense anymore. So tics are quite often like that. They can be whole phrases. It can be made up things. Like my son also had a tic that said doidle. And whenever we would introduce him, and this is before we knew he had Tourette syndrome, we would say, this is our son Graham. He would go, doidle. Hi, nice to meet you. And we would say, that's so rude, Graham, not realizing it was something he couldn't control. And, he would say it in the middle of sentences, and he would say it just as he was playing. And we finally got the diagnosis when he was 11 years old. So he was quite old.
Right. So the general outlook for Tourette's is, does it decrease with age?
It can. It's about a third of the people diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, the symptoms either go away completely or they become quite minimal. About a third of the people stay the same throughout their lifetime, and about a third, they get worse as they head into adulthood.
Really? That's interesting. I didn't know these figures. And about what percentage of the population, maybe in North America, have Tourette's?
Well, I believe they've done some studies, and it's 1% of adolescents and young children, so school-age children, and it decreases into adulthood.
And I seem to remember during your talk, you were, for the Monterey Skepticamp, you were speaking about some of the, I don't know what the word is, the more bizarre, the more interesting, to be polite, treatments and cures that have come your way from maybe well-meaning people.
Yes. One of the most common questions that I got as a representative of Tourette Canada originally and now the Tourette OCD network in Alberta was something called a tic tamer, which is a homeopathic medication that is supposed to reduce the number and severity of tics. And it came up quite often, and because I think parents are desperate to help their kids, and conventional treatments are difficult to find that help. And they take a lot of effort and they take a lot of time. And sometimes finding the right medication is very, very difficult. It can take sometimes years to find something that will actually help the student or the kids. And so parents are really desperate. And I think that was the most common one. And I think right now on Amazon.ca, it's going for about $116 for 2 ounces.
Really?
It's very expensive. And it's water, right? It's homeopathic.
Yeah. It's either sugar or water, of course. But
right.
This is a familiar story. If some, and let's look at parents. They have their child there who has a problem and they want to help as much as possible. And maybe they're not getting very far with tried and true techniques, which might take a long time or have mixed results. Is it any wonder they reach out for promises of cures?
Exactly. And one of the things that feeds into people believing that these things are working is Tourette syndrome has a natural tendency to wax and wane. So it naturally on its own will get better. And it can get better for a month at a time. And we certainly saw that with our kids. I called my oldest son 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. We'd have 3 really good weeks where everything was going really well. The symptoms were great. And then 3 weeks where it was terrible. So you could see they give them the drops, they get better, and they go, wow, look at how well it works.
Yeah.
And so then they do it again, and there's this repeating cycle, and they really truly believe that it's actually having an effect.
All right. So what other, apart from homeopathy, what other methodologies or treatments have come to your notice?
Well, the other one just came to my notice recently, is essentially a muzzle that it was called a tic silencer.
Oh, good heavens.
And yeah, and that's available in both the U.S. and Canada. And there's a woman who does YouTubing, and she's a Canadian girl that I met through Tourette Canada, a lovely young lady who has very severe Tourette syndrome. And she did a video about this and was very, very enraged naturally about this, because could you imagine, it's already stigmatized having Tourette syndrome, and then you're walking around with this muzzle that's supposed to stop you from ticking, and particularly verbal tics. It was supposed to stop the vocal tics. And in my view, knowing what Tourette syndrome is like, I could see something like that actually making the tics worse. So I think that it's not a very good treatment.
No.
I guess you could try to be kind and say, if you didn't strap it on their head, that if they used it as a means to try and mitigate their verbal tics, and it was something they wanted to do, fine. But most kids, especially young children, wouldn't have the ability to use it properly, and to strap something on their head, I think, would be very cruel, in my opinion.
It sounds like something out of the 17th century, doesn't it? Or some wacky,
it does.
Or some wacky treatment like that.
Yes, yeah. And the other one that, of course, are very common are dietary measures. Lots of people I've come across will cut out sugar, they'll cut out gluten, hoping that will have an effect. And there's actually no studies that have shown any of that is effective. The only thing I could find is that caffeine can make the tics worse, but that's, a possibility. It's not even researched that well.
Yeah. Well, it sort of makes sense in the back of your head. A stimulant might make tics worse. I think they help my tics, actually. A coffee in the morning settles me down a little bit. Caffeine addiction, who knows?
Well, I know this is a personal anecdotal thing, but I know my kids, my oldest and my youngest, don't like to drink alcohol because they find their tics get worse if they drink alcohol. So they just they'll have one drink. They're just not drinkers, which is a good thing. There's one other bit of information that I found really interesting regarding the dietary stuff. They did a survey. I don't remember the people who did this survey, but there were 115 people who returned their surveys. And of those 115, 101 people used supplements, dietary supplements, like vitamin C, vitamin B, vitamin A. There was a whole gamut of things that they were using, omega-3 supplements. But what shocked me the most is I think it was 72, or in the 70s anyway, we're using more than 10 supplements a day.
Oh, wow.
To try to help with the Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
So that was really disturbing when I found that out. Of course, it was a survey, so they're hard to judge the reliability of, but I think it was very telling about the desperation that many of these people have with trying to help their kids with Tourette syndrome.
Well, it's the old story, isn't it? If one pill is good or perceived to be good, then 3 must be better, and 4 even better, and have a stronger dose, and so on and so on. But what,
exactly.
Generally speaking, what is the tried and true treatment or approach?
Well, there are, of course, pharmaceuticals, which I've just talked about a little bit, and how difficult it can be to find the right medication that will help with the tics, as well as with, say, the obsessive compulsiveness, the anxiety, or the ADHD that tends to go along with Tourette syndrome. So it can take a while. And of course, there's always side effects. So that's one of the reasons I think people turn to these CAM modalities is that they don't like the side effects that are happening with their kids, and they're not getting success right away. The other treatments that happen are called CBIT, which is cognitive behavioral intervention for tics, which is essentially a version of cognitive behavioral therapy that's specific towards tics. And there's exposure and response therapy are the most common treatments. So it's when I went through with the psychiatrist with my kids, it was sort of a multifaceted treatment plan. We often had occupational therapists involved to help with sensitivities. We had neurologists involved with medications, as well as a psychiatrist, as well as psychologists to do the behavioral therapies that I described. So it was not just one doctor. I had very extensive treatment with my kids, and it was successful.
That's good to hear.
In my opinion.
That's very good to hear. Now, if people, especially in Canada, want to find out more, maybe they listening to this, they've realized somebody that they know may well have this situation going on. What's the best place they can go? What's the URL?
Oh, well, there's Tourette Canada. If you Google Tourette Canada, that's a great place to start if you're not in Alberta. If you're in Alberta or, say, BC, we've got the Tourette OCD Alberta Network, which is through the University of Calgary. And if you Google that, it'll come straight up. I don't actually know the URLs. Can I send that to you and you could put it in the show notes? Would that be something we can do?
I certainly will. Don't worry, folks. Don't worry. I mean, you can just Google those or you must listen to the Skeptic Zone, Adrienne, if you know about the show notes. I bet you listen to the show.
Just not to the very end until recently.
That's right. Well, now you know what to do.
Exactly.
Well, listen, Adrienne, thank you very much. What a fascinating topic it is. And I really enjoyed your talk at Monterey Skepticamp, which I will link to on the show notes again, because I think that's all available online. It was recorded at the time. But for now, once again, all the way there in beautiful Alberta, Canada, and Calgary, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
I started listening to Ono, Ross and Carey shortly after I broke my arm, and the doctor had told me I'd never walk again.
Thank you, Ross and Carey.
Ono, Ross and Carey is just a podcast. It doesn't do anything. It's just sounds you listen to in your ears. All these people are made up. Goodbye.
Logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. They are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This time, we'll look at affirming the consequent.
This is when you assume or conclude a cause for a phenomenon is based on the phenomenon itself without taking other possibilities into account.
You can think of this fallacy along these lines. If X happens, then Y is the result. Since Y has happened, then the cause must be X. Maybe our example will make this a little more clear.
I went to see a natural healer, as my cold was not getting better. She told me she'd seen this sort of thing before when another one of her patients had side effects from prescription medication. So now I know to steer clear of that medication in the future.
A stubborn cold may be caused by many things, ranging from picking up a second cold even as you are recovering from the first, confusing the cold symptoms with that of an allergy, possible side effects from medication, or even the cold virus itself being more resistant than normal to your body's natural defences. In our example, there is no good reason to conclude that the prescription medication must be the cause.
My natural healer told me if I took the homeopathic remedy, my cold would get better. Well, my cold did get better. Therefore, the homeopathic remedy worked.
Another example for our man with a cold. This time, he beat the cold. But does that mean the homeopathic remedy really did work? We can say that almost certainly it did not. So therefore, there must be another reason the cold went away. But maybe we can see why he mistakenly credits homeopathy as he trusts what the natural healer tells him. We've covered the appeal to authority before.
It's well known that Sasquatch leaves giant footprints behind. On a recent expedition, I found some giant footprints. Therefore, I know Sasquatch is real.
As intriguing as the idea of Sasquatch or Bigfoot is, and despite many giant footprints being found over the years, the reality of such a creature is still in great doubt, and that is after decades of searching. It seems then that those plaster casts of giant footprints we've seen, mostly from the 1970s and 80s, could well have been produced by another and very clever bipedal animal who likes fooling people with pranks. Sometimes it just seems logical to conclude one thing leads to another. Sometimes it does, but sometimes the original cause of an event may be something else entirely. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bijkersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.
I sure do miss going to those skeptical meetings in pubs and cafes to hear talks and interact with my friends. Oh well.
I think I can help you with that.
Who the hell are you?
I'm your skeptical fairy godmother angel from the internet.
You're my skeptical... What?
Relax, Richard. I can make your wish come true.
What? You mean free beer?
No. The other wish.
Oh, really?
Yes! I have news of skeptical meetings and talks online.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
Skeptics Cafe Online by the Vic Skeptics brings you live and interactive skeptical talks via Zoom. Anyone, anywhere in the world is welcome to join in on the third Monday of the month. Just check out the Skeptics Cafe page on Facebook to see when the next talk is and who will be presenting. Alternatively, see the Vic Skeptics website at vicskeptics.wordpress.com for details.
That sounds great. A skeptical god, fairy, angel, mother, person.
And there are similar skeptical online talks happening around the country and all over the world. All you need do is search for them.
Wow. Now, just one more question.
Yes.
What about the beer?
Okay, all right. Well, just for you. I'll make it so you can go to the supermarket, buy whatever beer you like, and drink it while watching the talk online at home.
And they say miracles never happen.
And to think I gave up being the tooth fairy for this?
What?
Nothing. Goodbye.
And now it's time to continue our weekly dive into Trove. And if you remember last week, we had a demonstration of psychic ability or clairvoyance by Mrs. Hughes, who was relaying messages from the dead, which, in my humble opinion, was nothing more than stock, standard cold reading. That is the technique of appearing to get messages from the dead, but really boils down to a series of questions like, do you know who is? Can you identify? Does the name Fred mean anything to you? Is there an R in your name? Things like that. And to pick up our story, Mrs. Hughes was giving a demonstration of her clairvoyance when she decided that she'd had enough. And I will read the last paragraph before continuing. Lord Amwell leaned forward anxiously, whispered to a neighbour, "Now there's a name I'd like to hear more about." But Mrs. Hughes hesitated, swayed a little, paused, her hand across her brow, and said that at last she felt the power had gone, and she could do no more. One or two in the room rose, while others, fascinated by what they had just heard, still sat expectantly, wondering if once again Mrs. Hughes' force would rally. "Do you mind if I go into a trance?" she asked. All lights were turned out except for two small bulbs behind red shades, lamps which formed part of an altar that had been arranged on the mantelpiece of the séance room. One 60-watt bulb was also left switched on under the dark shade of a tall standard lamp behind the medium's chair. She sat facing the circle, this dim light behind her silhouetted her features almost invisible. She asked for a little singing, and by degrees 2, then 3, 4, and more of the circle began to join in a hymn. But the group, including two famous clerics, dried up on their words, either through forgetfulness or embarrassed by unusual circumstances. Mrs. Hughes, who was sitting back in the chair, still in the conscious state, laughed softly. "And I can't help you." Another hymn was begun hesitantly, and almost at once it was noted that Mrs. Hughes' head had fallen back, and she grunted and shook herself. At once the voice of White Feather, her alleged spirit guide, was heard. White Feather. "Good evening. Mrs. Hughes is physically tired tonight." The medium turned to Lady Anderson. "Do you know Jean? Jean Clark? Jerry Clark? Jerry Clark, you used to call her. She used to sing. She used to talk like this." Mimics. "And good night and God bless." She resumed a man's voice. "There's a gentleman here. He passed over drowning, but not suicide. Howell, or Howard?" She turned to Dr. Bendant, who had previously been asked about Howard or Howarth. "Do you know Lady," to Mrs. Bendant, "a Len or Ken in the spirit world?" To Mr. Ainsworth, after leaning forward and holding his hand. "You have psychic power. You know you can heal? Yes. The day will come when you'll be able to heal with the hands. She turned to the surgeon and made a joking reference to his foot. Is there acid in the doctor? Then to Sir John. Jimmy Wilson. And again imitated a Scots voice, this time heartily. Nobody ever dies, he said. And the best is yet to be. Does anyone here know a lady who passed over with heart trouble? Adams. She is attired as if it were a sunshine day. White Feather spoke with a negroid accent here. Adams. Wesley Adams. Mr. Vickers. Oh, yes. Half laughing. Yes, I know that. White Feather. She was accustomed to wearing soft-coloured clothing. Laughs, then voice became soft. Is there a Mrs. Ainsworth? Could I take your hand? Mrs. Ainsworth stepped forward in the semi-darkness and leant over the medium. A lady wants to give you her promise that you shall listen in. She thanks you for all you have ever done. Mrs. Ainsworth thanked White Feather and sat down. Marjorie, turning to Mrs. Bendant. Marjorie, you know, Mrs. Hughes is physically and psychically tired. Perhaps she could arrange to take one or two of you privately. White Feather snorted. Mrs. Hughes threw her head back again and appeared to be coming out of her trance. Suddenly, a child's voice was heard, a little girl. The suddenness of this startled everyone. Will you come and speak with me? Very eagerly. It's a nice doggy. I've got a nice doggy here too. Did you ever have a Pekingese? I want to tell you that you can be happy. Everything will be all right. The child seemed to assume that these two members of the panel being addressed are husband and wife, although that had not been disclosed in conversation. Do you know what he should do? Is it a pain? A nasty pain? Yes, he should take vinegar and saltpeter for it. General laughter. The child sounded cross. And does he like a drink? Loud laughter. The child's voice was drowned in the laughter, and almost at once White Feather returned. The child was right. There is acid in the doctor, but he should do as she says. The two acids will drive out the other acid. The body is full of uric acid. The medium pronounced this utric acid. Well, and he must eat right. Yes, eat right. White Feather grunted. Mrs. Hughes threw back her head again, and in 12 seconds was out of her trance. Now the next section says, Panel's report on Mrs. Hughes. Lord Amwell. Unfortunately, when Mrs. Hughes hit upon the one Christian name that appealed to me, and about which I should have liked to have heard more, her power faded. The medium jumped about like a pea on a hot plate, and was not very convincing to me. She was admittedly tired and, as I thought, highly strung. Sir John Anderson. Most satisfactory demonstration. Both Christian and surname of the individuals given to me for identification, very convincing. A number of psychic sketches were made of entities present during the séance, some of which were recognized by the medium, and this is proof of the activity and the reality of the spirit world. Dr. Bendant. This, quite apart from a personal matter to which I shall refer later, was a relatively good session. In spite of a good deal of fumbling, there was a good deal of straight paranormal cognition, some of it of a pretty good order for this type of work. For example, the picking up of the name of Ainsworth, almost exactly, though in fragments, then quite later accurately. There was a good many other things too, which would bear out Mrs. Hughes' claims of being psychic. On the other hand, there was, except perhaps where I shall note this, no evidence of any kind of spirits, nor of contact with the dead. The whole thing can be explained by telepathy. For instance, the second picking up of Margaret Howard, or Howarth. by Mrs. Hughes is interesting. It means either that a person of that name, but a young girl, whose married name is different, has indeed died in childbirth, which she had not a year ago, as inquiries show. I am checking up on recent events since that time. Or that Mrs. Hughes picked up on something which the earlier medium had implanted in my mind, or else that there is some entirely untoward and unaccountable reason for linking up a person of that name, and who would be an older woman altogether, with me. Certainly, nobody in my family had either the name Margaret or anything like Howarth. The thing, I feel, which may have some direct link with the mind of the dead person, was the encouragement supposed to come from my mother-in-law. Mrs. Hughes quite rightly diagnosed impending changes and some uncertainty as to their wisdom and practicability. But the advice which, briefly, was to carry on fits in with my own and my wife's views. So she may only have been dramatizing what was already in our minds. But I have never felt myself cut off from my mother-in-law at any time since she died. It is difficult to explain this, but there has been no sense of loss or of absence. I have had no personal manifestations, but rather a feeling that she was still here and taking much the same benevolent interest in my activities as she used to while she was alive. Nor was it a sense of guidance. Had we been contemplating anything of the sort we are now considering, we should have gone to her and said, "What about it?" And she probably would have given a shrewd and intuitive answer. This felt rather the same. Now comes the crucial point. This is not evidential in any way, nor am I myself in any way certain about it. All I can say is that this may have been so, and that it gave me a pleasant glow of reality which none of the other experiences with mediums had given before. I emphasize this because I believe that the sense of dead people surviving is entirely personal and convincing only to the one who experiences it, and even then only if he is reasonably sure that he has debunked his mind of the many factors which would make him wish to believe. This is a thing, unfortunately, rare anywhere, but especially among those who frequent seances.
Mrs. Haldane.
She undoubtedly has a considerable degree of extrasensory perception and showed paranormal characteristics. She did not convince me in trance.
Canon Knight.
I had the impression here of a medium who believes that her work is part of a Christian presentation, although in the prayer she made I could not help noticing that she left out the words, "where 2 or 3 are gathered together." Was this on purpose? I could suggest a stop in the mind as to whether it is indeed in the name, i.e., in agreement with the mind of Christ. Her identification of Mr. Ainsworth was remarkable if she had never met or heard of him. Could she have heard the panel mentioned somewhere and retained the name in her subconscious, and by telepathy made the contact? I could not feel that anything she said really evidenced identification of departed spirits beyond question. There were so many mishits and errors in contrast to apparent correct ones. She asked if anyone had a little daughter in the other world. I admitted to this, and she got the illness just about right. But she gave no name, and when she brought in a small girl in trance, there was no connection with me. Anyway, it was 14 years ago, and the child, on their belief and mind, should surely grow up. I dislike this trance effort. Any major reshuffle of human personality and shift of reasoning power away from the conscious level makes me feel we are deserting the true road and trying a queer pathway. Surely, spiritualism should evaluate the reason, not go beneath it.
I keep feeling that we are being pulled down below our present levels and not in any way raised above them. And that, to me, is a criticism of the whole effort. And there's a little box right at the end of this page which says, next Sunday, the panel investigate British mediums who tell how mediumship develops. And that was part 2 in our series Into the Unknown, first published in The Sun in Sydney, Australia in September 1950. And maybe you, like me, could tell that, call it clairaudience or a trance, that it was, to my way of thinking, simply an extension of cold reading techniques. And it's interesting that people at the time had different opinions, but including that it wasn't really contacting the dead, it was really more telepathy. So yes, next week we continue Into the Unknown. How does mediumship develop? This was one of the questions the panel was asked to answer. The Riddle of Spiritualism, a frank investigation by a panel of experts. And if you are impatient, of course, you can read that and many other interesting reports and articles over the decades at Trove, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia, digitised newspapers and magazines and so on at trove.nla.gov.au. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Tune in next week for more in our series Into the Unknown. And also more logical fallacies coming up. And we discover that Maynard and I, moonlighting, have a Ring Up an Astrologer service. Eh? What? Find out what that's all about next week. Thank you to those people who contribute to the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. As I said at the top of the show, with all the shenanigans going on in the world, it's more important than ever that people have access to critical thinking and skeptical material. And if you'd like to contribute to the Skeptic Zone, you can do so at skepticzone.tv, Patreon or PayPal. Lots of people have decided that $5 a month is about the right sum, which is just a tiny bit over $1 an episode. So if you think the Skeptic Zone is worth $1 to you each week, or just over $1, then that would be great. Some people chip in a little bit less, and I thank them very much, and some people chip in a bit more, and in some situations quite a bit more. And my gratitude goes out to Marco Witt, who sent me details of his podcast called Where Did the Rabbit Go?, which I'm just discovering. And I'll link to that in the show notes, and a particular episode, which is episode 49, where Marco looks at psychic predictions for the year 2020. And for me, being immersed in predicting and predictions for the last 4 years with this project, it's interesting to hear somebody else's take on the whole area of psychic predictions. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to the afterthoughts, the people who keep thinking after the music. For those people new to the Skeptic Zone and thinking what the hell's going on, sometimes, most times, after the show, after the music goes away, the dice come out. And this week I have a D10, 10-sided die. I have my dice rolling contraption here, sent to me by listener Greg Doré in the Bay Area. Thank you, Greg. I'm going to roll this die 3 times, maybe even 4, who knows. And it's up to you to predict the number that's going to come. Speaking of predictions. Right, and I might even include a D6. Anyway, for the first roll, it's a D10, so guess away. Will it be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Here it comes. The first number this week is 8. So write that down. 8. Second number coming up. 8. One more. One more with a D10. The last number is 7. Sounds like some secret code. This week's winning numbers: 8, 8 and 7, and the supplementary, I should go into the lotto business, will be on a 6-sided die. Here we go. The supplementary number, the last one. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6. 1. 8, 8, 7, 1.